Muchas gracias, Inés. Alumnos aquí en esta Facultad de Comercio, profesores, amigos y también para el público que nos está viendo en la sesión online, en este ciclo dedicado a la India, India at 75 Lecture Series. Es un ciclo de conferencias que organizamos en colaboración con la Universidad de Valladolid, la Facultad de Comercio, desde Casa de la India, con la Embajada de la India y también con Casa Asia. Saludamos al público que nos está viendo en los diferentes rincones del planeta. Tenemos con nosotros a un ponente excepcional que nos va a adentrar en el mundo de la tecnología y de la revolución del IT en la India. Voy a ser muy breve en presentarle para escuchar sus ideas y su versión de esta maravillosa revolución que tuvo lugar en la India, en el sentido de que fue casi inesperado lo que ocurrió. Kiron Ravindran es Assistant Professor en Sistema y Tecnologías de la Información en IE University. El interés de Kiron está en los temas de enseñanza del área de sistemas de información. Obtuvo el doctorado en la Universidad de California, Irvine, y se centra en la estrategia de aprovisionamiento, la gestión de tecnologías de la información, la gestión y diseño de contratos, el análisis de las redes sociales de las empresas y la economía de los sistemas de información. Y por tanto es profesor de este área de sistemas de información y enseña en los programas de MBA Internacional y Global MBA. Y como anécdota, también me apunta aquí, ha estado en Valladolid, sí, como deportista, para hacer la ruta del Canal de Castilla en bicicleta. Muchas gracias, Ravindran, y nos interesa mucho escucharte.
Thank you, Guillermo. Thank you, Inés. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to those of you that are connecting online. ¿Ahora mejor? No, ahora sí. Vale. ¿Habéis visto? No. You've seen the meme where Sofía Vergara says, no? That you don't know how intelligent I am in Spanish. Yo siento igual. You don't know how intelligent I am in English si no hablo en inglés. So, I'll speak in English, pero acepto preguntas si hace falta en cualquier idioma, hindi también. Yo tengo un problema, que no puedo hacer nada sin tocar el móvil cada 3 segundos. So, I have a solution for you if you have the same problem. If you go to a website called Slido, SLIDO.com, I encourage you to go to this website, slido.com. It will ask you for a code. In that code, if you put in Valladolid, I think all small, or I don't know if it makes a difference, but if you put in Valladolid, you will reach a page which has question and answers. Has anybody seen that already? Slido is S-L-I-D-O, SLI.do. And yes? Okay, there's one question already, which is very important, which says, hola, ¿qué tal? Okay. Now, if you think you have the same question, you can press the up arrow and it goes up in the list of questions to be answered first. If you want to add another question, you can just add another question. Would you like to try it? Just put in another question. Type something in there. You can add whatever question. It's anonymous. Yes or no? Okay, if you add a question in there, I can see the question. Has anybody put in a question? So do I like the color blue is a question. Very good question. Thank you very much. How did you read my mind? I really like the color blue. So if you have the same question, you can upvote it. So now you know how this works, right? So during my talk, I would appreciate it if you stop me and ask me questions. But if you choose to not stop me because you feel you might be stopping my flow, you can use the app to ask questions, okay? Every now and then I can pause and I can look at it, or you can raise your hand and I can look at it, or something like that. This is a very, very big task. I'm going to attempt to explain the history of India as an IT destination in about, I don't know, 30 minutes. But I really don't have anybody to blame, because when Casa de la India asked me, you know, what would you like to talk about? I said, why don't I talk about this? And then the moment I said yes, I was like, oh my God, now how do I condense this history? And so my attempt is to try and kind of create a sense of how big this industry is, how it feels, what it feels like to work here, and so on. Has anybody here traveled to India? Has anybody here heard the stereotype of India as an IT destination? So do you know that India is like the #1 IT destination? Okay. So it's an interesting story how it came about. If you don't want to hear the talk, and if you're not attracted by this, there is a TV show called Outsourced, which is actually quite true. It's a comedy and they make fun of us, but that's all true. It's absolutely true. If you don't want to watch a series which has multiple episodes, there's a movie called Outsourced, and it's only 1 hour long, and it's a nice romantic story as well, which is also absolutely true about this American guy that goes to India and kind of discovers blah blah blah. To put this in context, the slides that I have are all graphs mainly from Statista. Okay. If the graphs don't are difficult to kind of appreciate because that's not your world, I'll try and put this in context by using a comparable story. Okay. There is another tab open with PowerPoint. It should come on. No. But, so the Indian IT industry, to throw a number, is $170 billion. Okay, now that's a big number. But what does it compare to? How big is this number? The Spanish tourism industry is about $150 billion. Shall I try now? There you go. The Spanish tourism industry is about $150 billion. Okay. So now start visualizing this. Think of everybody that you know that has somehow worked or linked with tourism. Every camarero, every hotel employee, every friend of yours that works in a travel agent, every airline crew. All of that is Spain's tourism industry. That's kind of the size of India's IT industry alone. Okay. But this comparison is not fair because the GDP of these two countries are not the same, which means the size of the economy of these two countries are not the same. So I compare these two. In India, 8% of the GDP comes from tourism, comes from IT. Okay, which means for every dollar that Indian government holds, 8 cents came from somebody writing software. Again, how does that compare to Spain? Well, in Spain, tourism before COVID accounted for about 12%. Okay, so now it's a fair comparison. So the country has a bigger GDP, almost double. If you consider purchasing power parity, it's almost 3 times. But if you compare the industry as a portion of the economy, it's comparable now. Now we can make the same comparison. So every time I go into the plaza and I find a camarero, with the same frequency in India, if I walk around, I'll find an IT programmer. Right? So that's why it's so common, the stereotype of the Indian IT guy. Okay. I know it's big. How many people work in it now? So 4.5 million people as of 2021 work in this. But it's a country of 1 billion people, so who cares? In Spain, all of tourism contributes to 3 million people. Okay, so now we have a comparison that's not equal, because here we have an industry which is contributing almost the same share to the GDP, but is staffed by 3 million people out of 40 million people in the country. Whereas there it's 4 million people out of 1,000 million people, right? So it's a small set of people actually that's contributing so much to the government, which means, oh, okay, so these are not like, I might bump into an IT person, but it's not like bumping into another camarero, because these are all, high value adding employees for some reason. So now you have a bunch of things that might come to your mind. So there are these people that are earning so much money for the government. How could it be that this one person earns so much money for the government? Well, actually, they're not selling in the local market, right? If you don't sell in the local market, if you sell in the exports market, it's possible that you can earn much more for one unit of labor. These are the big names. Maybe you heard of this. There is a big conglomerate in India called the Tata Group. Tata Group has this IT company called Tata Consulting. Tata Consulting is the largest IT company in India. Their revenues is about $17 billion. Again, it's a big number. How do I make sense of this number? If I stack the first 5 companies in terms of revenue, I used to work for that 6th company, which is why I included it in the graph. I didn't work for the top 5. I worked for the 6th one. The 5th company in that list is called Tech Mahindra. Tech Mahindra and Tata Consulting and Larsen, the 6th company, have an interesting history. These 3 companies came out of manufacturing companies that have existed for a long time. And then suddenly they want to get into IT and they start an IT division and it becomes very successful. Which is a story about many IT companies actually. So Amazon selling cloud computing, they didn't get into cloud computing. They made cloud computing so that they can sell their books and toys and whatever they sell on Amazon. And then they realized that cloud computing business is so good, and they made a cloud computing division, which brings in more money for Amazon than Kindle or anything else that they sell on their platform. Mahindra or L&T used to be a manufacturing company. It had many little companies in between. In the 80s and 90s, we implemented a software called ERP. ERP is to link every department in the company to every other department. We got really good at it. And we said, we can sell this service. And that's how L&T Infotech comes about. TCS is 17 billion. But if you go down the list, number 5 is this company called Tech Mahindra. If I compare that 296 billion rupees, it compares to the revenue of Indra last year. But here's a difference. Last year, Indra made a net loss of 55 million, whereas Tech Mahindra made almost a net profit of about 60 million. So the same size company with twice as much, profitability in some ways, right? While countries in the West all suffered from the pandemic, IT companies in India actually, benefited. Any thoughts? Why might that be? Why do you think? I'm just looking here to see if there's any question. There are no questions. Why do you think Indian IT companies kind of enjoyed a good year last year? Any opinions? All right. So last year or 2 years ago, did you notice that suddenly every restaurant removed their menu and put a QR code? Yes? Every bank suddenly had an online option. All the banks thought, old people would never use technology because, they like to talk to a human. And suddenly old people said, no, I don't want to come to your bank because if I come to your bank, I will die. So give me an online option. So suddenly the chief technology officer, the chief innovation officer for all these companies were like, we have to go online in a few weeks. Where would you go if you suddenly want software developers to develop you a software solution in a few weeks' time? India, right? So the Indian IT companies had like a boom time. Last year 2020 was an excellent year for Indian IT. why does this sector, therefore, as I was saying earlier, why does it generate so much money? Well, 85% of this business is exported. How do we compare this now? If you think about an export from Spain that the whole world knows about, what might come to mind? What do you think the whole world knows about Spanish products? Wine, yeah, and oil, right? So if you go anywhere, there's Spanish olive oil. Most of it is actually not made in Spain, but that's okay. It's Spanish olive oil, right? And so it's not surprising you have a $170 billion business where 80% of it is actually exported. So which is why if there's resistance in North America because they don't want one more Indian programmer, it's because all the Indian programmers are going and sitting there. Right? Of course, there's a resistance there. That's how this business has been functioning. And actually, the first graph that I showed you traces back to 2001, but this proportion of exports has decreased slightly. When we started out, we were almost 90% or 95% export. Then to reduce our risk a little bit, we started selling in the Indian market as well, and we kind of diversified which market and so on. So far, questions? No questions. There's a band called Indian Ocean. That's my favorite. Their songs are my favorite songs. I like wine. Not so much. I prefer Jerez, but I guess we are also a country that consumes a lot of alcohol. So it's maybe not surprising that instead of wine, I like fortified wine, more alcohol for the money. Okay, if this thing works very well. If you have questions, please post it in there. Any other questions? That's not come up. You have this in the back of your mind, but you don't know exactly who to ask. You can't ask Casa de la India such a question. Any questions?
Percentage of outsourcing companies in India. More or less, according to the IT program.
So,
can you repeat the question for the?
I can repeat the question. I think, if I understand the question is, what percentage of companies in India are IT companies?
I mean, companies not from India. I mean, North American companies, British companies, German companies, Chinese companies, or any other countries outsource their services to India.
I don't know a market that does not outsource their service to India. Yeah. I don't know of a country that does not outsource service to India, actually. It would be hard to find an example that doesn't have, because I think also many of these international companies, whether it's Accenture or IBM or Dell, they have what are called captive centers based in India. So you might be getting a service from Accenture based in India. There is a funny video. You know how in the US there are drive-in McDonald's. So you go to a McDonald's and you speak to this, and the person takes the order, and when you go to the next window, you get your burger, right? McDonald's tried it out where you speak not to a person there, but you're speaking to a person in India, and that person processes the order and sends it back, and the burger is processed. So technically you could be buying McDonald's, but the service is being delivered, at least the IT part of the service is delivered by somebody in Bangalore. So there are many. So early in the days, now it's kind of mature. Early in the days, it was kind of a common joke about not understanding the accent and people being trained to take on a different name. I'll come to that in a bit. There are these call center training schools in India, like there are vocational training schools here to make you a carpenter or a plumber. There you would come from the village, you don't have a college education, but you're trained to speak English enough to do this call center work. Then you're trained on the geography of North America. You want to know where Boston is, where California is. Then you're trained about the weather, about baseball, and then they make you take a name. So I will pick up the phone and say, "Hi, I'm Andrew, and I'm actually in Boston." And of course, my accent will reveal where I am from in like 2 seconds. And then those people will ask, "Are you really in Boston?" And I say, yes, I'm in Boston, and I saw the game today. That was all part of the industry back then. Now it's changed, the laws changed and all that. So anyway, back to the question. I think the reach of the service delivered is possibly global. Okay. On the question of how can India address this human capital, I will come to in just a bit. The working conditions for Indians in Spain compared to the US is actually a very interesting question. And I don't have details, but I have anecdotes. The supply side, all these people that are being churned out to this industry, where do they come from? Now, again, to put this in context, India has officially recognized 5,000 universities. Okay. I am pretty sure this does not include many of the famous institutions that you may have heard about. The business school that I did my MBA in is in the top 10, but it's not a university. It's not an official university. So I'm guessing that is not included in this 5,200, right? So there's possibly much more. In comparison, the US has 3,000 universities. Indonesia has 2,000, blah, blah. Spain, that's the first 4. And then I jumped to the line. I think Spain is number 16 or something on this list. Spain has 266 universities. Let's just put that in context, right? If every promotion, let's say every convocatoria is about 1,000 students, that's 5 million students coming out every year. Okay, that's like every year there's a new Madrid being created, or a new city of Madrid being created in terms of just university graduates. Again, let's put this in context. India spends only 3.5% of its GDP on education, which is, I think, embarrassing. But it spends only 3.5% of its GDP, whereas Spain spends 4.2%. Now think about this. Spain's economy is half in terms of numbers of India's economy, right? And they take 4% of that, which means at least we should have put 8% from India if we were just comparing apples to apples. Or they should put 4% over there, comparing apples to apples. So this 4% goes to 260 universities, whereas the same 4% there goes to 5,000 universities. What can you infer about the university? What might you be able to infer about this university? One university here gets 25 times the money as a university in India. Opinions? What do you think? Where? In Spain, right? So possibly, and I'm making a hugely generalized statement, right? So maybe the quality here is actually much better, but we are playing a quantity game in India, right? We are playing a quantity game because sure, there might be one good engineer that can fix what is called Y2K. I'll come to that in a second. It's like a mindless IT problem. But you can get 20 cheap IT engineers that can do it because it's a mindless problem anyway. It doesn't require much innovation or much, you don't need to have a patent to do that problem. This is just engineering graduates in India. Okay. Now, looking at computer science, mechanical, electrical, civil engineering, electronics, and then electrical, it's about 3 million engineers per year. All the STEM degrees in the US, okay, not carrera. In the US, you can have an associate degree without a university. You can have the you can have the degree, the bachelor's degree, you can have the master's degree, you can have the PhD. All of that put together in the US, it's only 750,000 in STEM. STEM is science, technology, engineering, and I think math. This is just engineers. I didn't count the science people. Okay, and why that is important is also interesting. I'm a mechanical engineer. I wouldn't be able to fix my car. I wouldn't be able to fix anything. I got into my engineering school because I wanted to study and I thought this is what I wanted to do. My friends, who I think are very intelligent people, many of them are in very senior leadership position in organizations. They all studied engineering with me. I know engineers that wouldn't be able to change a light bulb, right? Because we have a problem. We have only that option. I never had the option of studying philologia when I was when I was 18, right? Because if you're in India, the social pressure, the norm, the culture, blah, 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 you study engineering or you study medicine, or if you can't get into these two, then you become a lawyer, right? Or if you can't get into these three, then you study commerce. Because that's like, oh, really, now it's changing because business is suddenly a good thing. So all these people churn out. Not many are very good engineers. Not many can actually send a rocket or build a bridge or any of that. But that's okay, because what was happening in the early 90s or late 80s was there was a need for so many people that could write any kind of code that we just needed bodies to sit in the desk and write the stuff. And not even original code. The code is written by somebody. You just needed a bunch of people to kind of tweak it. So the business at this point was called body shopping. So body shopping was the American company would tell the Indian IT company saying, okay, how many people can you get? How soon? And then the Indian company would say, well, here are 30 CVs. Okay, here are 30 CVs. Can you start processing the paperwork? We can have them here in 2 weeks' time. At that time, in the software export processing zone in Bombay of TCS or the company that I was working in, there would be 30 people just kind of waiting, and it's called being on the bench, like a substitute in football. You're just waiting for your call. When you get your call, you start your paperwork and boom, you land up in wherever and you start this coding. Right? Nobody else could compete because no other country had so many engineers waiting to start writing code. So it's not surprising that we kind of took over the market, right? So putting together the previous two data points, there's far less money going to universities. There's probably the idea of engineering as a vocation. I didn't know among my friends. Very few people have had this, but you did it because that was what is required to do. And therefore, it's not surprising there that this study, which is extremely embarrassing, says that 90% of Indian engineers lack key skills. So this is the debunking the myth part, right? Employability of IT engineering graduates for IT product engineering was 3.4. I don't even know how this thing is measured, but if they're comparing the same thing, IT engineers with a 4-year degree in engineering cannot be hired as an engineer. They can be hired as a technico or a network management person, which in Spain, you wouldn't hire an engineer to manage to, put your Movistar router and configure that. And when you call them, it's not an engineer that's picking it up, right? So there is a difference in the way the skills are distributed in these markets. I mean, in some ways, it's kind of reassuring that China also has the same problem because they are potentially a competition with equally large numbers of engineers coming out, right? For us, at least for now, we have a short window of advantage, which is, hey, they're just as bad as us and they don't speak English. So for some more time, we can survive. In comparison, there are far fewer engineers that come out of the US, but supposedly they have less of this problem of employability. Okay. Questions, comments, thoughts, opinions? I can go back to this. Yes. Sí. Adelante.
I speak loudly.
I can hear you very well.
Great, thanks. But given the challenge of India, etc., of China, etc., is India not thinking of perhaps trying to get into hardware IT, into microprocessors? That's also a very high added value and now globally important segment of IT. But if not possible just in India in the short term, is India perhaps now linking or could link with Taiwan, Korea, South Korea, etc., to create an IT space in the Indo-Pacific, which is now the buzzword now?
Can you repeat the question so that the
Sure.
online people can also...
If I can summarize the question, so India has been doing services. When is India going to get into manufacturing, right? Why is India not creating an Indo-Pacific hub, maybe collaborating with Taiwan or China or the rest of China or South Korea to create semiconductor manufacturing hubs, right? I think it's a good question. I cannot answer with an official position on what Indian government is doing, but I know there was a Made in India campaign a few years ago. I don't know if many successful microchip manufacturing plants have been set up out of this. I'm not familiar, but let's think about this for a second, okay? So here's a country where if you've gone to college, you speak English, okay? If you've gone to college, you've studied some amount of programming. The amount of programming that is required to do this job in the US or in the West is actually very little. So think of it today as creating a good PowerPoint slide. I don't need to be a graphic designer. I don't need to have English skills because my spell check will correct my English and the clip art library gives me the graphic design. So I can put together a PowerPoint with very little training. This is very highly, there's a high margin on this at this point in time, early 90s again. Whereas I have to compete with an established partner that knows how to manufacture very, 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 very well, which is China, right? I don't think, especially for semiconductor manufacturing, it's not like manufacturing plastic. It is a very complex industry, no? So my hunch is we will never be able to run the race fast enough to beat them or fast enough for them to even want to collaborate with us because we are so small. You see, why will Ronaldo want to play football with me? No matter how much ganas I have, he'll never want to play football with me. How can I convince Ronaldo, look, let's form a team and then together we can take on the world? He'll be like, no, who are you? I don't need you to sell semiconductors or play football in the world. No. So whereas if it comes to the other side, if you talk about software development, I'm Ronaldo. I don't want to play with anybody else. You see? So I think that's really the thing. I think it's a comparative advantage argument that I can do software better than I can do anything else. You can do hardware better than you can do anything else. Maybe if we both do not misbehave, Dell will buy services from me and hardware from you and we'll both be happy. Therefore, let's behave. You know, I think that's what is likely the equilibrium now. Any other questions? Okay. This is an excellent question. Let me just jump to this. How much does it cost to study in India? That's a great question. So I didn't grow up in India. I grew up near the Middle East or in the Middle East, near Dubai. I went to India to do my equivalent of SO4 when I was 15 years old. And then I did my undergraduate in engineering. And then I worked for a couple of years. I did my master's in India again. And then I worked for a couple of years. And then I went to study in the US to do my PhD. So when I went to the US to start studying, I was about 30 years old. And I went with a bank balance of about only $3,000. I had only $3,000. I didn't want to take money from my parents. Okay. Whereas I had a colleague who was an American who was studying with me. He had done his undergraduate at USC, University of Southern California, which is a very expensive university. And then he did his master's, his MBA at Wharton, which is a very expensive university. And then he came to the PhD with me. We both get a salary every month of $1,500 US. He had, at that time, a debt to the bank of about $500,000 US. Okay, so which means he would spend the rest of his life paying back his debts from education. No matter how, I mean, you have to be super rich to wipe off a $500,000 debt. Whereas I started with no money but no debt. So in India, my engineering undergraduate cost me, I think, 1,800 rupees a semester. Now, to put that in context, at that time, if I went for lunch, it would be 18 rupees. So it would cost me only 100 lunches to study an entire semester. And this was a government college. It doesn't have much funding. It's not the best university. My labs look terrible. My machines were terrible. But hey, I finished an engineering degree from one of the few elite engineering colleges where you can get in without paying money. It's like the Selectividad. So I got in through Selectividad. I got my degree and I didn't spend any money. Right? I probably spent more on maintaining my old motorbike than on my university. My MBA was more expensive because it was a private institution, not a university. But in my MBA, what I paid was equivalent to about 2 years' salary at that time. Okay, which means in 4 or 5 years, I've paid off that debt as well. Yeah, I've completely lost track of time. I don't know till when I go.
We have about 8 more minutes.
I see. In which case, the short story becomes even shorter. I don't think I can advance here, and maybe this will also work. No? Okay, so actually all of India's IT history can probably be can go back to this year in 1967, where this company called TCS, the one I mentioned, the Tata company's IT company, Tata Group's IT company, is created. Okay. At this time, it's very old technology. It's not particularly fancy. There is no World Wide Web. There's no internet. There's no ERP. So they're creating software for mainframes. They write code in a language called COBOL, which you've never heard of because nobody studies COBOL today. In 1981, TCS creates something called the Offshore Development Center, which means if Repsol wants software written, TCS will come and say, for you, we will create an offshore development center with dedicated staff. They'll have a badge which says Repsol. Nobody other than the people that have Repsol in this badge can enter the space. So imagine this space in Bangalore dedicated to Repsol. And they will have stickers of Repsol, all that stuff. People will know this business. Only this team can enter this business. They're working for Repsol exclusively. Repsol would come every 6 months or whatever. There'll be a big visit, photographs and garland and lamp and all of that stuff. That business model was created by the IT people in this point in time to service people, companies in the West, and to assure them that the business, when it goes to Bangalore, will get done, and it's getting done in a nice, clean place, because everybody has this image of, oh, India is chaos. So how do I make my IT work? Soon, something called IT parks come up. Buildings that look fancier than the Hyatt Regency at Barcelona is basically just meant for software developers writing code. There's everything that you can imagine: free food, there's taxi service 24 hours, there's security guards. Your home is a disaster, but if you come here, you feel like you're in a 5-star hotel. And so you write code all the time. In the early 90s, there's a big thing called the Y2K that's feared. Has anybody heard of this stuff? Okay. So before you were born, there was a previous century called the 1900s. In this 1900s, when we wrote software code, we didn't ever think that the date would need to be 4 digits, because 75 was 75. And then you reach the 80s, and then that was it. And then the 90s. And then when we reach the 90s, we were like, oh, shit. When it starts reading 00, what's going to happen to all the systems? Because I've put in my pension funds, which is maturing every year. And then after 99, it goes to 00. I lose all my savings. Because the bank now thinks it's minus 25 years that I've put in the credit, right? So that's only the bank. Then think about all the systems that calculate distance or time. So all the airlines, for instance, the airplanes, the bookings, what happens to all of this stuff? So in the early 90s, the world went into a panic and said, oh my goodness, we have to change all our systems to address this Y2K problem. That was globally about a $600 billion business. All of IT today in India is 178 or 200, let's say. This is 3 times all of India's IT that time in 1999 or 98. The job of a software programmer was to look at the code. Wherever there was DDMMYY, you have to replace that with DDMMYYYY. That doesn't require an engineering degree, right? But you needed this to be done, and you needed this to be done at scale. You needed this to be done for the entire, in the US alone, it was a $200 billion problem, and you needed this done in about 3-4 years' time. Where do you get these people from? Aha, there's this continent of engineers waiting for you, right? So that was really the big boom. And conveniently, all the software that had this problem was written in this language called COBOL that nobody's studying, because that's only used to program mainframes. And who's interested in mainframes anyway? And therefore, where were people trained in COBOL? Again, India, right? So you've created this magic environment for Indian IT companies to come and take over the process of servicing IT problems. In around 200,000 Indian engineers supposedly arrived in the US towards that time, towards the end of the 90s. Okay. Now the US government is facing a problem. Like, there is no provision to bring in 200,000 engineers. Also, the US labor is going to get like completely annoyed, right? So they have an immigration bill. George Bush, the father, creates an immigration bill and calls it the H-1B visa, which allows people to go there with the path of citizenship. Because it's not hiring temporary workers seems like a bad idea, because I'm a programmer, you hire a temporary worker and that person is getting my job. So that was not approved. But if it was immigration, this is US and they want to promote immigration, blah, 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 it was allowed. And so this law comes into place. People can come into the US through that route. And then a few years later, we have conveniently the euro problem. You have to convert all this currency to euro. Again, similar kind of business, similar kind of problem. It's not engineering. It's a mindless job. That comes into place. And then there is the dot-com boom. Again, there's a whole lot of IT people required. So we've had all these lucky breaks, I think, in history for us to grow so much. Now we've come to the point where, okay, COVID hit, companies don't have money. What do we do? I think the future you're going to see less of this, let's take this job and get it done to India versus can Indians innovate for me? Okay, can they bring innovation ideas for my company? And you'll see if you're following this industry, fairly recently, some of these large companies like the TCS and the Infosys have been buying out European design companies, because it's not just creating boring software anymore. You have to create things that look good as well, in addition to being innovative. So I'll stop there. I think in the interest of time as well, I'm open to questions, if any, if you have time. Otherwise, I can look at this and see if there's anything that I can address now. I speak 5 languages. I've studied 3 more that I don't speak. Which is my favorite one? Spanglish. I kid you not, I think in Spanglish. There are some words that I don't know how to say in English anymore.
So thank you very much,
Thank you.
Kiron. It was a fascinating, condensed history of India's IT story. It's a privilege to have you here, and I think you ended on a positive and optimistic note. I do think, and we all share the same vision, I think that innovation is the future. Whoever happens to innovate, even beyond the manufacturing versus outsourcing or soft, hard dichotomy, I think innovation is the main thing. So let's stay there in the optimistic path, and I hope we can have you again sometime soon. Muchas gracias a los alumnos, muchas gracias a la Facultad de Comercio, a los profesores, a la directora del máster, Inés, y a la Embajada de la India, Casa, Asia, y desde la Facultad de Comercio os invitamos a conectaros el próximo día 27 en el máster de Economía de la Cultura, Gestión Cultural. Tendremos a Asad Lalji,